In 1966, a man sat down on the edge of his bed in a monastery in Vietnam. Outside, a war was destroying his country. His students were dying. His temples were burning. He had 48 hours before he would be exiled, permanently from the land where he was born. He could have spent those hours in prayer, in grief, in anger. Instead, he did what he did every single morning. He sat still for 2 minutes. He listened. And then he got up and changed the world. His name was Thich Nhat Hanh, and for the next 50 years, through exile, through loss, through the deaths of people he loved, he never once skipped those 2 minutes. This is the story of what he did, and why it worked. Thich Nhat Hanh was born in 1926 in Quang Nguy, a central Vietnamese province caught between mountains and sea. He ordained as a Buddhist monk at 16, not out of pressure, out of recognition. He later wrote that the first time he saw an image of the Buddha, serene, sitting, unmoved, he thought, "That is what a human being can become." By the time he was 30, he was one of the most respected young monks in Vietnam. But Vietnam in the 1950s and 60s was not a place that rewarded stillness. It was a place on fire. The French had colonized it for decades. Then the Americans arrived. Then the bombs. Nhat Hanh watched the war devour his country from inside his monastery walls, and he made a decision that would get him expelled from Vietnamese Buddhism entirely. He refused to choose sides. He called it engaged Buddhism, the idea that a monk's responsibility was not to withdraw from suffering, but to walk directly into it, to help, to heal, without picking up a weapon for either army. In 1964, he founded the School of Youth for Social Service, sending thousands of young volunteers into bombed villages to rebuild homes, set up schools, and tend to the wounded. In 1966, he traveled to the United States. He met Martin Luther King Jr. He asked him to speak out against the Vietnam War. King did, and the Vietnamese government declared Thich Nhat Hanh an enemy of the state. He was 39 years old. He would not be allowed to return home for 39 more years. Here is the thing about Thich Nhat Hanh that most people miss. They hear exile, they hear war, they hear loss, and they assume the peace he taught must have come after all of it, something he found on the other side of suffering. It didn't. He was practicing it during. The 2 minutes every morning, the practice he would keep for half a century, didn't begin when life became safe. It began when everything was falling apart. That is the point. So, what was the practice? It was not a technique, not a method with steps and stages. It was a single instruction he gave himself each morning before doing anything else. Before speaking, before reading, before tea. He called it arriving. He would sit on his bed, on a cushion, sometimes on the floor of whatever room he was living in that week, and he would do one thing. He would listen to himself breathe, not control the breath, not deepen it, not slow it down, just notice that it was happening, for 2 minutes. He described it in his 1975 book, The Miracle of Mindfulness, written remarkably as a letter to a friend while he was living in exile in Paris with almost nothing. He wrote, "Breathing in, I know I am breathing in. Breathing out, I know I am breathing out." That was the whole instruction, 14 words. But here is what those 14 words were actually doing. The human mind, first thing in the morning, does something automatic and almost violent. It begins planning. It begins worrying. Within seconds of waking, most people are already rehearsing arguments, running through to-do lists, dreading the day ahead. The nervous system spikes before the feet hit the floor. Nhat Hanh called this running. He said, "Most of us are running even when we are sitting still. The 2 minutes were designed to interrupt that running, not to create peace, not to manufacture calm, but to notice, just once, just briefly, that underneath all the running there was something that had never moved at all." He called it the ground of being, and he believed every human being had access to it, every single morning, for free, in 2 minutes. In 1982, Thich Nhat Hanh founded Plum Village, a monastery in the Dordogne region of southwest France, built on farmland donated by supporters. He was 56 years old, stateless, still banned from his home country. Plum Village became something nobody expected. It became one of the most visited spiritual communities in the Western world. By the 1990s, thousands of people were arriving each summer. Psychologists, veterans, CEOs, people who had never meditated a day in their lives and didn't know why they had come. What they found was not what they expected. There were no dramatic ceremonies, no long silent retreats that broke people down before building them up. There was morning sitting. There was walking meditation. There were meals eaten slowly. And there was the 2-minute practice. Nhat Hanh taught it to everyone, regardless of background, regardless of belief. He would say, "You don't have to be a Buddhist. You don't have to believe anything. Just breathe. Just arrive." A Vietnam War veteran named Claude An Shin Thomas visited Plum Village in 1991. He had been carrying the war inside him for 20 years. He later wrote about his first morning there. He sat down, he tried to breathe, he couldn't. He tried again the next morning. And the next. On the 4th morning, something happened. He described it as a silence inside the silence. Like finding a room I didn't know was there. He wept for 2 hours. Then he ate breakfast. Then he came back the next morning. Now pause for a moment, because something important needs to be said about the number 2. 2 minutes sounds almost insultingly small. If someone told you they had a practice that could rewire your relationship with anxiety, with grief, with the chaos of ordinary life, you would expect it to cost something. Time, effort, years of training. Nhat Hanh disagreed. He believed the problem was never that people lacked the capacity for peace. The problem was that they believed peace was far away. Something to be earned, something that required more than they had. He spent 50 years arguing the opposite. The present moment, he said, is the only moment available to us, and it is the door to all moments. 2 minutes, one door. Nhat Hanh never cited neuroscience. He didn't need to. But in 2011, 45 years after he first described the practice, Harvard Medical School published a study that made headlines around the world. Researchers led by Sarah Lazar found that as little as 8 weeks of brief daily mindfulness practice produced measurable changes in the brain's grey matter, specifically in 2 regions. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for decision-making, focus, and emotional regulation, and the amygdala, the brain's alarm system, responsible for the spike of fear and anxiety that most people feel before their day has even started. In people who practiced, the amygdala shrank, not metaphorically, physically. The alarm got quieter. The study required 8 weeks of practice, but the minimum effective dose they tested was, almost exactly, 2 minutes of daily breath awareness. When journalists asked Sarah Lazar what she made of the connection to ancient Buddhist practice, she said something careful and precise. She said, "They were running the experiment before we built the lab." Nhat Hanh, when told about the study, reportedly smiled and said nothing. In January 2022, Thich Nhat Hanh died at his root temple, Tu Hieu Pagoda, in Hue, Vietnam. He was 95 years old. After 39 years of exile, he had finally been allowed to return home in 2018. He spent his final 4 years exactly where his practice had begun. On the morning of January 22nd, the monks who had cared for him gathered in his room. He had been unconscious for several days, but just before dawn, his breathing changed. It became deliberate, slow, even. The monks recognized it immediately. It was the breathing of someone who was practicing. He died at 12 o'clock midnight, Hue time. The monks sat with him in the dark. No urgency, no grief breaking the surface. Just breath. Just the same 2 minutes, stretched out, finally, into forever. The next morning, one of his senior disciples, Sister Chan Kong, who had worked alongside him for 60 years, was asked how she was. She said, "He taught us that no one is ever truly lost, so I am not lost today. Tomorrow morning, before you check your phone, before you speak a single word, before the day gets its hands on you, you have 2 minutes not to fix anything, not to become anything, just to notice that you are breathing, that underneath the planning and the worrying and the noise, something in you is already still. It has always been still." Thich Nhat Hanh spent 79 years as a monk. He wrote over 100 books. He was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by Martin Luther King Jr. himself. He rebuilt communities after wars. He counseled presidents. He sat with dying soldiers from both sides of the conflict that destroyed his homeland. And when they asked him, near the end of his life, what the most important thing he had ever taught was, he didn't mention a book. He didn't mention a philosophy. He said, "Breathe, you are alive." 4 words. The same 4 words he had been saying to himself every morning since 1944. Since he was a 16-year-old monk who had just seen a painting of the Buddha and thought, that is what a human being can become. He became it, and he left the door open for you. The monastery at Tu Hie Pagoda still opens its gates at 5 in the morning. Every morning, the monks sit in the dark before the bell rings. 2 minutes of silence before the world begins. It has been that way for 300 years. It will be that way tomorrow.